Hello, chess fans. Today's game was an honorable mention on my best of the 2000s list. It's Magnus Carlsen versus Alexander Thug Life Grischuk from Linares in 2009. Ultimately, Grichuk and Ivanchuk won this event, but Carlsen, who is already fourth in the world, won this game in beautiful style. Playing white, Magnus opens the game up with pawn to e4. Grischuk responds with c5, and we're going to get a very theoretical Sicilian defense. I'm not going to dive deep into the theory, but these moves have been played thousands of times by grandmasters. In fact, today, Magnus really is not known for engaging in a big theoretical debate. He's always trying to find a fresh path when possible, but as a junior player, he was very booked up, and this is very typical. Junior players tend to know what's going on in the opening. They're studying hard. They're studying openings often more than their opponents. So both players follow theory up through about here when Grischuk strikes out with e5, a really important break in these Scheveningen type structures. Now, most popular here, but not by a huge margin, is pulling back knight d to e2, hoping that when these pawns are exchanged, you can gain some advantage in recapturing, and maybe I think that you'll get a knight to d5 more quickly. In this game, Magnus plays f takes e5, which has only been played 3 times in the chess.com database, but it's certainly a reasonable move. Magnus is fighting for a legitimate opening edge in this game, and it works out well for him. So this move, even though it's not quite as popular as knight d e2, seems to be a very viable choice. So from here, we're pretty much on original ground. D takes e5 in this position. The knight pulls back to b3. Notice that the bishop and the knight are combining to gain some important influence on the dark squares here. Knight to b4, bishop a7, gaining a nice tempo on the rook, pushing it to a slightly worse square a8, a little worse than b8, and then also tickling the queen a little bit and gaining control over the d8 square. That's going to be very important later in the game. So at this point, notice how Magnus is fighting for control of key squares, and that fight is going to pay off later on. Chess is a game of 64 squares, and a lot of times you'll see that good strategy is just about gaining more control over squares than your opponent. So bishop b6, queen to e7, rook a d1. And now here's where Grischuk really could have equalized with a strong move. The best move in this position, recommended by Stockfish, is bishop to g4. And the thing about bishop g4 is that exchanging off what looks like a really bad bishop on f3 does a lot to neutralize white's main plan in the position, which is to put a knight on d5 when the knight is either tremendous or you get a trade, and then white gets a potentially dangerous d-pawn. So this neutralizes that idea. If you jump in with knight d5 right away, then knight b takes, and then a push with e4 is totally fine for black. Here you're doing very well, and the pressure here on this line means that you're going to get some favorable exchanges. In the game, actually, this bishop went to e6 instead, and Magnus jumped at the opportunity to drop this knight onto d5. Now, things are getting tactical, and there are certainly chances for Grischuk to still get a tenable position, but when this knight hops into d5, it is Magnus who is pressing in this position. Bishop takes d5, e takes, and then e4. This is the move that Grischuk is relying on here, and Magnus meets it with pawn to d6. So we see here battling past pawns, but it is the passed d pawn that is by far the more dangerous pawn, especially because, again, this bishop is controlling the important promotion square. So after d6 here, it looks like maybe the best square for the queen is queen e5. Now, obviously, the queen is beautifully placed here. This is a very, very central square, but you have a couple of questions tactically in this position. One question is, what if I just pull the bishop back here and I gain tempo on the queen? Well, here there's nothing wrong with queen takes d6. You kind of need to check about the tactics in a position like this when you line the queen up with a rook and you allow discoveries, but there's nothing dangerous, so you are able to kind of walk into bishop d4. The other question is, what happens if you just push forward immediately with d7 here, and you're attacking the rook and you're on this promotion square? The thing is that you can just take that, because when white captures, you're able to capture on f3, and this position is totally fine for black. For example, queen takes f3. Okay, there's a few things that are being threatened in this position, but a move like rook to e7 really resolves the pressure in this position, and white also has a number of things hanging. This is totally fine for black. So d6, and actually Grichuk picked queen e6. Now this seems very reasonable because you're a little more in touch with this d7 square, but queen e6 seems a little bit worse because it walks into knight c5, and this knight is really a monster of a piece. So now the queen moves over to f5, going for a queen trade, but Magnus is never one to turn down a favorable queen trade. He's happy to trade queens here because this is a position that's about to pass d pawn, and when the queens leave the board, the pass d pawn is only gaining in strength. Now knight bd5, and actually in this position, Magnus could already get tactical with some exchange sacrifices on f6, but in this position, he plays pawn to a5, keeping a big clamp and defending his bishop. Grichuk plays knight takes b6, a takes b6 here. And now this was kind of the last opportunity for Grichuk. He had to be very precise because the position is super dangerous at this point. The correct defense would have been rook ec8, allowing, for example, knight takes b7 in this position, but then you can go rook takes c2, and even though these pawns look a little bit dangerous, they're under control, and you're doing fine here as black. And if white just plays b4, which makes a lot more sense, keeping this big clamp here, black can play rook c6 in this position. It's still a little bit scary, but this is not a bust for Grichuk. He's under pressure, but he can fight on in this position. The rook has gotten some activity and is putting pressure on the critical white pawns. Instead, though, in this position, Grichuk played the move rook a to b8. This is definitely the losing move. He's not going to get a chance to come back from this. And this is a great moment to pause your video and try and figure out what Magnus Carlsen played right here. Well, the critical move here is rook takes f6. Boom! A really strong move. Not too difficult. Not Magnus Carlsen's most challenging find ever, but still very nice. After rook takes f6, the main point is actually simply the fork of a fork here, right? We are forking a rook and forking the fork on f6. So we're going to win back the exchange, and then this d pawn is so much more monstrous than it already was. In this position, there's no good option for Grichuk, so he moves the pawn forward to f5, saying, all right, if you're going to win the exchange back, at least I'm not going to lose, the pawn I had on f6, but that's not going to change things too much. That pawn was irrelevant, and Magnus immediately seizes on the important factor in the position, which is the queenside pawn mass. These pawns are very dangerous, and he's surging forward. Also, he's still got his fork, so he doesn't need to take on b8 yet. That's good too, but he's going to leave that exchange there until he wants to capture it. Pawn to a5, push forward again, c5, bishop to g7. Now one of the forks is covered, so it's time to cash in. Knight takes b8, rook takes b8, and pause your video again if you want to figure out the clean finish that Magnus played. Well, Magnus played the move bishop to a6. Boom again. Again, not the most difficult move in Magnus's career, but very nice. After bishop to a6, the simple point is we are going to have 3 connected passed pawns, and we don't even need 3 connected passed pawns. 2 will do us. There's nothing that Grichuk can do about this. We are going to give up the bishop, and we are going to get an unstoppable set of pawns. Grichuk does play bishop to f6. Bishop takes b7, another Nice sacrifice. We're forcing black to take that bishop that black tried not to take a moment ago. And then c6, the pawns are rolling. Rook takes b6. And you have to be accurate one more time here. There's actually only one winning move here. You can't push forward right away because rook c6 actually stops the pawns dead in their tracks. Neither can advance. And black is threatening bishop e5, which will win both the pawns and the game. So after rook takes b6, that only winning move is rook to c1. Of course, Magnus has it. And after rook c1, there's nothing to be done. You can no longer stop the pawns from progressing. We got one more move from Grichuk. Bishop takes b2, attacking the rook. We don't need to defend the rook. Pawn to d7, and the game ends. A really beautiful game from Magnus. I hope you liked that game. If you want to see more games from Magnus and my top 10 games of the 2010s, then click on the playlist that's sitting right on top of the screen.